The Battle of Agincourt is one of the most famous and decisive confrontations in medieval European history, fought between the English army under King Henry V and the vastly superior French forces. With its resounding victory, the Battle of Agincourt not only affirmed the strength of English military strategy but also marked a pivotal turning point in the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France. This battle has since stood as a symbol of courage and military intellect, achieved despite overwhelming odds. 2 months prior to the clash at Agincourt, King Henry V had led an army of roughly 11,000 men across the English Channel, launching a siege against the French port city of Harfleur in Normandy. After a grueling 5-week campaign, the city finally surrendered. However, disease and relentless combat had taken their toll, cutting Henry's army almost in half. When the king decided to withdraw toward Calais to regroup with the English fleet, he could not have foreseen that a massive French force, estimated at 20,000 troops, awaited him near the small village of Agincourt. At this moment, the English army, composed mainly of archers, knights, and foot soldiers, was exhausted, weakened, and vastly outnumbered. Yet, they were about to face one of the most legendary trials in military history. In the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, a key episode of the Hundred Years' War, the English and French armies confronted one another with sharp contrasts in size, organization, and tactical doctrine. The English were outnumbered, but they benefited from tighter command, disciplined troops, and masterful use of terrain. These factors, more than raw numbers, would shape the outcome. The English army. Most historians agree King Henry V's force was significantly smaller than the French host, and Currie places the English around 9,000, while Juliet Barker, Jonathan Sumption, and Clifford J. Rogers argue for a figure closer to 6,000, comprising roughly 5,000 longbowmen and 900 to 1,000 men-at-arms. Sources such as the Gesta Henrici Quinti and the Chronicle of Jean Lefebvre describe the army's composition in detail. Although some modern scholars question the precision of these records, Rogers maintains that the lower estimate is plausible given losses to disease and fatigue after the siege of Harfleur. Accounts differ on English casualties in the wider campaign. Some assert minimal losses thanks to strong defensive tactics and terrain, while others emphasize the toll of illness and harsh weather before the battle. Structurally, Henry's army was compact and pragmatic. Longbowmen formed the backbone. Lifelong training in the longbow gave them both reach and power. Men-at-arms, often minor nobles or veteran professionals in plate and mail, held the center and served as the close combat corps. A small contingent of light cavalry handled communication, banners, and royal protection rather than shock charges. Henry deployed in a narrow front, with archers on both flanks and men-at-arms in the center, the king himself positioned where he could quickly reinforce any threatened point. The concept was straightforward: compress the field, force the enemy into a funnel, and let discipline and archery decide what numbers could not. The French army. The French host was larger but less coherent in command, and Currie estimates around 12,000, while Bertrand Schnerb suggests up to 15,000. Rogers, Mortimer, and Sumption placed the likely total between 14,000 and 15,000, including roughly 10,000 heavily armored men-at-arms and 4,000 to 5,000 archers and crossbowmen. In addition, many nobles marched with armed retainers, raising the total number of people on the field, combatants and attendants combined, well above the formal count. Internal rivalries among noble houses fractured the French command structure. Multiple magnates sought precedence, slowing coordination and muddling execution. The fighting arm of the army centered on heavy cavalry and armored infantry, formidable on firm ground, but vulnerable in mud and congestion. Archers and crossbowmen were present in number, yet their deployment and timing were not integrated effectively with the main assault. The English brought fewer soldiers but superior unity of command under Henry V. The French possessed greater numbers but suffered from divided leadership. The English built their plan around longbow fire, tight formation, and ground that constrained the opponent. The French relied on the prestige of heavily armored charges and frontal pressure, assumptions that worked poorly on a saturated, narrow field. English discipline and cohesion contrasted with French overconfidence and fragmented decision-making. In practical terms, the English expected lower losses if their formation held and their bows could cut down assaults. The French risked high casualties if bogged down and compressed by terrain. Agincourt was set by these imbalances, a small, disciplined army exploiting terrain and timing against a larger, prouder force hindered by mud and divided command. On such ground, order defeated mass. Before the Battle of Agincourt began on the morning of October 25, 1415, the differences between the two armies, English and French, were already clear. The contrast in numbers, organization, discipline, and mindset would decide the outcome before the first arrow was even fired. On that muddy field, a small, exhausted English army would overcome one of the largest and proudest noble hosts in Europe. The first difference was in size. King Henry V's army numbered only between 6,000 and 9,000 men, mostly archers and light infantry. Many were weakened by disease after the long siege of Harfleur. The French army, by contrast, gathered between 14,000 and 20,000 troops, including thousands of heavily armored knights and their attendants. But the vast French numbers became a disadvantage. Their massed ranks filled the narrow valley between two forests, leaving little room to maneuver. The English, though fewer, were compact and coordinated, able to shift and respond as one unit under a single command. Leadership was another decisive contrast. The English army was unified under the personal command of Henry V, a young but resolute king who inspired obedience from noble and common soldier alike. Every man knew who commanded and trusted the decisions made at the front. The French army, however, suffered from divided authority.
To arms!
Although Constable Charles d'Albret was nominally in command, powerful nobles such as the Duke of Orleans, the Count of Alençon, and the Duke of Brabant all insisted on their own plans. Pride and rivalry among the French aristocracy prevented any clear coordination. Each noble sought glory for himself rather than victory for France, and their refusal to act as one would soon prove fatal. The structure and tactics of the two forces were equally different. The English army was built for flexible defense. Its backbone was the longbowmen, archers trained from youth, able to release 6 arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to fire one. Henry V positioned them on both flanks, protected by rows of sharpened stakes driven into the ground to repel cavalry. Behind them stood the men-at-arms in lighter armor, ready to fight hand-to-hand once the enemy drew close. The French relied on the traditional power of heavy cavalry. They believed that a single charge of armored knights would crush any resistance. But when rain turned the ground to a swamp, the horses bogged down, and the proud chivalry of France collapsed into chaos under a storm of English arrows. Discipline and morale marked another dividing line. The English soldiers were weary and underfed, yet their formation held. Years of training in Henry's leadership kept them calm and silent even as they faced overwhelming odds. They fought as a single body, each man trusting the one beside him. The French knights, however, let pride overcome restraint. Their attacks began before the full army was ready. Units advanced out of sequence, colliding with one another. Horses trampled foot soldiers, banners tangled, armor became a prison in the mud. Courage was abundant, but discipline was absent, and bravery alone could not save them from their own disorder. Terrain and weather favored the English. The battlefield lay in a narrow valley hemmed in by woods, the soil soaked from days of autumn rain. Henry deliberately chose this ground, knowing the French could not deploy their superior numbers. The English occupied the higher, firmer ridge, while the French crowded below on low ground that sucked at boots and hooves alike. When the charge began, the weight of armor and mud trapped the attackers. Men fell, others stumbled over the bodies, and the whole line became an immobile wall of confusion. The terrain itself became the English ally. The two armies also reflected two opposing cultures of war. The English represented the rise of practical, organized, and strategic warfare, a discipline based on training and tactical calculation. The French still embodied the old ideal of medieval chivalry, where honor and valor were seen as the highest weapons. On the field of Agincourt, that ideal met its end. The age of knights charging for glory gave way to the age of soldiers fighting with precision and purpose. The longbow and the stake replaced the lance and the code of honor. When the battle ended, the contrast between the two sides was written in blood. More than 7,000 French were dead, including many of the highest nobles in the kingdom. The English lost fewer than 500. Henry V's victory was not just a military triumph, but a turning point in history, a moment when intellect, discipline, and adaptation overcame numbers, pride, and tradition. The Battle of Agincourt became a symbol of reason defeating arrogance, of order overcoming chaos, and of a small, determined army reshaping the destiny of nations. The first storm of arrows rose into the mist. Thousands of shafts curved high and vanished into the gray sky before falling like black rain. The sound was unreal, like 1,000 drums rolling through the clouds. When the arrows hit, armor rang, horses screamed, and the front line of France shuddered under the weight of death. On the ridge, King Henry V remained on horseback, unmoving. His red cloak whipped in the wind, eyes locked ahead. Around him, English archers worked with deadly rhythm, draw, loose, like an endless machine. The air itself buzzed with death. Across the valley, Charles d'Albret gave the order to charge. The French knights surged forward beneath blue and gold banners. But the earth betrayed them. The valley floor was a trap of rain and mud. Hooves sank, armor dragged, lances dropped. The noble charge dissolved into chaos before it even reached the enemy. A second wave of arrows screamed down. Steel tips pierced helmets and joints. Horses panicked, rearing and colliding with one another. Men were crushed under hooves and their comrades' weight. What began as pride became terror. Hold the line, Henry's voice carried through the rain. Behind the wooden stakes, English soldiers braced themselves. The French cavalry hit the barricades, and the stakes impaled both horses and riders. The living crushed the fallen. The valley turned into a writhing mass of men, armor, and blood. The archers, having spent their arrows, dropped their bows and drew mallets and knives. They moved in among the bodies, striking with brutal precision. It was no longer war, it was survival. Mud, breath, blood, and steel filled the air. Charles d'Albret launched his second line, but there was no ground left to take. The valley was already packed with the dead. Men tripped, fell, and suffocated under armor meant to protect them. Some cried for mercy. Others drowned standing up. The prayers of knights turned to silence beneath the rain. Henry stepped down from his horse. His boots sank into the bloody mire. He walked calmly among his men, sword in hand but lowered. His presence steadied them. They fought not for conquest, but for the man beside them. Rain and blood mixed into one color. French banners toppled, one after another. A knight of Brabant raised his sword defiantly and vanished beneath a storm of arrows. The English pressed forward, step by step, unstoppable. A cry echoed across the field, "The Duke of Alençon is down." For a moment, everything froze. Then the slaughter resumed, louder, heavier, desperate. By midday, the French vanguard was crushed against its own rear. Armor ground on armor. Men suffocated where they stood. A few knights tried to surrender, but were swept away by the tide behind them. There was no command, no formation, no hope. Henry ordered the archers to reform. They had no arrows left, but they obeyed. Dropping their quivers, they drew daggers and waded into the melee beside the footmen. The king and the soldiers fought as one, rank and crown erased by mud. On the French flank, panic spread. Riderless horses crashed through tents. Wounded nobles crawled toward the forest. The proud blue banners faded into the mist, replaced by smoke and crows. In the center, Charles d'Albret fought on foot. His armor was caked in mud, his movements heavy. He raised his sword toward the English line and fell, trampled by his own army. With him, France lost its command and its heart. Henry lifted his visor at last. His face was smeared with blood and rain, his eyes clear and hollow. Before him stretched a field that no longer looked human, only iron, earth, and silence. He raised his hand one final time. The English advanced slowly, methodically, clearing what remained. The storm of arrows was over, now came the storm of men. Blades rose and fell in steady rhythm until nothing moved. When the rain eased, only crows remained. Broken helmets, shattered lances, and blood-soaked banners littered the ground. Henry stood at the center, sword buried in mud, surrounded by exhausted survivors. No one cheered. They only breathed, the breath of men who had seen death too closely to celebrate it. Trumpets sounded from afar, not for victory, but for the dead. The wind carried the smell of iron and smoke. Agincourt had become a graveyard and a legend.